The musical heartbeat of a city brought down by racial division.
There were raids, there were arrests, people were taken away.
A training facility in Belarus used for a terrifying show of strength.
Everyone in the West is acutely aware that this could be World War III.
And a mighty fortress in Indonesia, built in a time when nations behaved like pirates.
This relic was once the site of a furious battle, raged over the most unlikely of treasures, worth more in weight than gold.
Decaying relics, ruins of lost worlds, sites haunted by the past, their secrets waiting to be revealed. In the state of Louisiana, where the Great Mississippi meets the Gulf of Mexico, lies the vibrant city of New Orleans.
We're on LaSalle Street in the Central City neighborhood. This is not a neighborhood that tourists usually spend a lot of time in.
Among well-kept homes are a scattering of run-down buildings, one of which could easily be overlooked.
It's dilapidated, some of the windows are boarded up, and you can see where the old signs and hoardings used to be. As you enter through the old doors, you see what looks to be a reception area or ticket booth.
In one part of the complex, there's a perfectly preserved barber chair.
Out front, one distinctive sign has survived and reveals what this place once was.
And this sign should call up memories for any fan of American roots music.
This locale has a legendary name in music history.
The Jujube Inn was a light, and this light attracted people from all over New Orleans and all over America.
As well as great names, it attracted huge controversy.
This place was victim to constant raids.
The drop was pushing boundaries, and it would bring the wrath of the local law. Curtis Doucette is a property developer trying to restore this club to its former glory.
So we're in the space that was the nightclub, and there was a stage here. It wasn't just music, there was full entertainment. I mean, a full show. There was shake dancers here. There was one gentleman, I believe it was like Iron Jaw or Metal Jaw or something like that. I've heard stories, it's unbelievable, but of him chewing glass, for instance.
By the 1950s, the Drop, as it was known, had become a mecca for America's R&B greats.
You had folks like Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, Ike and Tina Turner.
People like Ray Charles, Otis Redding, James Brown. Little Richard even wrote a song about it.
There's stories about like maybe the first rock and roll song, was sang here.
This was a gathering place, not just to see great music being performed, but a place where musicians could hang out when they're in town. One newspaper called it the South's swankiest night spot.
Its fame and popularity were born out of the restrictions of living in the Jim Crow South.
So Jim Crow is the colloquial name given to the laws that separated American citizens from each other. White institutions were financed and maintained, whereas the separate institutions for African Americans were left to dilapidate or didn't exist at all. In some cases, hotels were white only, and there were no hotels for African Americans.
One of the great ironies and injustices of this era was that black musicians were often invited to play white clubs, but they couldn't even necessarily sit at the bar and have a drink in that club or stay in the neighborhood where the club was located. They had to find a place to stay and hang out after the show.
That left a gap in the market, a fact not lost on one young man working nearby on LaSalle Street.
The man behind this whole complex was named Frank G. Pania. And he was a real visionary and a real representative of a kind of entrepreneurship that helped build the Black community in the days of Jim Crow and segregation.
His grandson, Kenneth Jackson, recalls how he sees the opportunities these laws could offer.
He was a barber by trade, and he decided to bring his family to New Orleans. And he started his barber business, and when the property came up for sale, he and his brother decided to purchase one side of the building, and they had the idea to start a club, you know, to start like a bar. And then they added on live entertainment.
Kenneth has fond memories of living here as a child and enjoying this unusual playground.
We'd come in, and when they were cleaning up the bar, and they had a set of instruments that were on the stage, and you could get up there and beat on a drum or play with the piano or stuff like that, you know. Always some entertainers or musicians that were there that were like part of the house band, and they were basically almost like relatives to us, you know. My nickname was Rooster, so all of them would call me Rooster, but it was a festive environment. Everybody wanted to have a good laugh, and it just felt like a family.
Frank had also purchased the other side of the building, allowing him to further expand the enterprise.
So the Dewdrop was a multi-purpose business, right? There was a barbershop here, there was a restaurant here, there was a bar, there was a nightclub. All of those things existed within this space, which is about 13,000 square feet. Hotel is pretty much now what it was. There's 29 rooms here. Most of them are very small rooms. So this is one of the smaller rooms, and one of the few rooms that actually have a bathroom in it.
Soon, the drop was added to the famous Green Book.
So this was basically a guide for how African-American motorists were to navigate the Jim Crow South, and let them know where they could be arbitrarily denied service, food, lodging, not to mention be arrested for no good reason. This was an essential tool for anyone Black in that age trying to travel.
The Dewdrop fit in the Green Book network because it was a place where you could rent rooms, you could eat, you could get your hair cut. You know, it was just a welcoming type of atmosphere for people that were coming to town.
The Dewdrop Inn, therefore, formed part of a network of Green Book-led institutions that kept up and maintained a space for African-American entertainers. In many ways, these places provided a heartbeat and a lifeline for this culture.
It's heartbreaking to think this was necessary, and the injustice of it still rankles, but this was the reality. So the Dewdrop Inn was kind of a beacon on this landscape of hospitality for anyone who came through the area.
Ray Charles and Lil Richard made the most of Frank's hospitality. Both lived and recorded here in the mid-1950s.
We're talking a who's who of entertainment back in the days. It was just a place where musicians, if they weren't playing there, they would come there to find out where work was.
So the Dewdrop Inn was an anchor for a whole network of musicians during a period when these musicians were not only transforming American music, they were making music that would transform popular music around the world.
But it was Frank's open-door policy that was so unusual for the time.
You had guys that dressed up like women, and you know, it was just part of the atmosphere.
At Frank's request, the famous female impersonator Patsy Vidalia became resident bartender, performer, and MC. Vidalia, known as the Toast of New Orleans, hosted an annual gay ball held here each Halloween.
Frank Panier, the organizer, made a space that was inclusive, not exclusive. African Americans mixed with their white counterparts. They even embraced notions of gender fluidity and had theme nights in which people were able to explore various forms of sexuality in a way in which would have been unheard of in the established nightclubs of New Orleans.
For the time, it wasn't acceptable everywhere. Everybody didn't agree with that, that should be allowed. But it was okay at the Dewdrop, That was a part of society that people were overlooking, but my grandfather didn't care, It was like he felt that, they deserved to be seen in their own way.
But in such a racist, divided society, this level of tolerance and success drew some serious heat.
It really took an immense amount of courage for him to offer this open door policy, but he did suffer for it.
The authorities decided to shut down the Dewdrop Inn. This meant that on a weekly basis, there were raids, there were arrests, people were taken away. The attempt was to make sure that the inn closed for good.
There were times when my grandfather actually had the police pull up outside with what they called paddy wagons back then. And if they knew that they had white people in here, they would arrest everybody in the place and take them all down and charge them with racial mixing.
There's also times when there weren't just raids, but there was just harassment. Police driving by telling people, you better not go inside. If I catch you inside there, then I'm taking you to jail.
These arrests were commonplace, but one particular raid made national headlines.
In 1952, the actor Zachary Scott got arrested at the Dewdrop Inn for disturbing the peace, and Frank Panier got arrested for the crime of serving blacks and whites together, which was actually against the New Orleans City Code.
After years of constant harassment, Frank sued the city, arguing that the Jim Crow laws were unconstitutional.
Panier took the suit all the way up to a federal court, but before a verdict could be reached, the civil rights laws were passed in 1964, legally ending segregation.
This is absolutely what Frank wanted, but incidentally, it actually contributed to the demise of the Dewdrop Inn.
You would hear people around that time in reference to integration, they would say, well, the white man's ice is colder. And so people didn't come to the Dewdrop as much as they did because they had options, and particularly options that had been taken away from them for a very long time.
Sadly, Frank died of cancer just a few years after the dance hall closed in the late 1960s.
As a person, my grandfather was a real all-around nice guy, and he loved for people to enjoy themselves. He tried to help people whenever he could.
In 2005, a deadly blow was delivered, not just to the Drop, but to the whole of New Orleans.
Those of us who were here during Hurricane Katrina, we remember the infamous watermarks. This is one of the ways that we know how high the water settled in a place like this. So this, looks like maybe 2.5 feet or so that the water settled.
The impact of the hurricane was so great, the rest of the business closed and has sat abandoned ever since. Though devastated, this place is far from forgotten, and Curtis hopes to bring it back to life.
I would say my day job is an affordable housing developer. When I found out about this place, really the history of it is what made me fall in love. And so this is a passion project for me. My goal for the Dewdrop Inn is to make it as close as possible to what it used to be.
Walking through the building now is kind of a bittersweet situation. I basically have to realize my mortality. You know, I'm getting older. It's kind of like I need to pass the torch to a younger generation. It's in need of a lot of repair, of course, but I feel lucky or blessed to have it still in existence and with the potential of being refurbished and reborn.
In a remote region of Indonesia is a defensive structure built in an age of discovery, conquest, and greed.
It's an island paradise. It's hot and humid. There are fishing boats dotting the landscape. And at the water's edge, there's a cluster of one-story buildings.
Further up the hill is what looks like a castle. The imposing structure suggests a military history, but just whose battleground was this tropical island?
The brutal construction, at odds with the serene beauty of the surrounding land, suggests it was built by people a long way from home.
Its design is typical of the pentagon-shaped fortresses found across Europe. But here it's on the remote island of Banda in Indonesia.
There's a courtyard at the center with what looks like a well, and these strange square blocks where it's really not clear what their purpose was.
From the outer wall, still armed with cannons, you can see miles into the distance.
So clearly this was set up to stave off any threat from the oceans.
What was it here that required such immense protection? And what foreign force risked slaughter by launching a daring raid to seize control of the prized asset?
This relic was once the site of a furious battle, raged over the most unlikely of treasures.
The Indonesian island of Banda has long been coveted for its natural resources. Lukman Ang is a local guide, born and raised in this tropical paradise.
Profesi saya sebagai juru motret, namun saya juga berprofesi lain sebagai pemerhati sejarah. Sejarah tentang tanah kelahiran saya, karena dari sinilah akar sejarah dunia dimulai.
For hundreds of years, the location of the Banda Islands and their sought-after riches remained a closely guarded secret. Their eventual discovery would change everything.
Yang perlu diketahui bahwa sebenarnya imperium-imperium besar Eropa yang dibangun saat ini semuanya berawal dari tanah ini.
We've all heard the phrase, money doesn't grow on trees. Well, here in Banda, it did.
Spice was really the most valuable commodity of the age. And the Banda Islands were the jewel in the crown of this trade network. It was the only known place in the world where you could grow nutmeg and mace. Nutmeg was especially important because it was thought to prevent plague.
What value would you put on something that could cure you of the plague? Unsurprisingly, Europeans would pay an extortionate amount for this medicine.
In the early 1500s, only Asian and Arab traders knew where to find the prized spices. Among Europe's fledgling colonial forces, the race was on to find the islands and seize control of the lucrative trade for themselves.
Kenapa pada akhirnya Banda itu menjadi tempat di mana katakanlah seperti arena perang oleh para pelaut-pelaut Eropa, mulai dari Portugis, Spanyol, Belanda, dan Inggris.
The Dutch were next to discover the islands, and they swiftly forced out their European rivals. At first, they tried to strike a peaceful deal with Bandanese nobles that would grant them exclusive rights to the island's riches. But this contract alone wasn't enough to guarantee a monopoly, and they soon turned to another means of control.
In 1609, the Dutch admiral Verhoeven arrives in the Banda Islands with a request to build a fort, but the Banda people aren't going to hand over their land so lightly. Verhoeven and his men were ambushed and killed. The Dutch responded by destroying local ships, plundering villages, and executing local leaders.
This extraordinary violence led to the signing of a peace treaty which recognized Dutch authority over Banda and, even more importantly, over the spice trade.
And so what began as, trade really involved colonization and occupation.
Fort Nassau, built in 1609, would prove to be only the first of a number of strongholds constructed to safeguard Dutch interests in the area. What unfolded was a tragic story, stained in the blood of locals, spilt at the hands of foreign invaders.
By 1621, the Dutch still felt that they didn't have a secure monopoly on the nutmeg trade.
Some locals continued to trade with other nations in defiance of their treaty with the Dutch.
The Dutch had all the excuse they needed to initiate a massacre.
Nobles were beheaded, villages razed, and islanders tortured. It was a bloodbath.
The native population fell from 15,000 to 1,000 and maybe even less than that. By virtually annihilating the Bandanese people, the Dutch secured their monopoly, but at a horrible cost. In fact, the Dutch had killed so many Bandanese people that they needed to turn to and bring in enslaved labor from India and China to work on the plantations.
1621 itu menandai babak baru yang pada akhirnya Belanda mengendalikan Banda secara totalitas, diisi masyarakat-masyarakat yang baru, dibangun infrastruktur yang baru, dibuka perkebunan-perkebunan pala yang jauh lebih modern, yang jauh lebih baik dibandingkan perkebunan yang sebelumnya.
But the Dutch weren't alone in their endeavors. The British also had their eye on the region.
The Spice Wars were about to enter a dangerous new era, and for that, the Dutch needed a new stronghold.
As tensions increased, the Dutch built the larger and more strategic Fort Belgica.
Benteng Nassau ini gampang diserang secara terbuka oleh siapapun, sehingga mereka berinisiatif untuk membangun benteng yang ada di puncak bukit ini.
The Belgica fort, which is still standing today, was begun in 1667 and took 6 years to complete. And once completed, it could garrison 400 troops.
Every inch of the fort was intended to inspire fear among locals and deter any would-be European attackers.
Setiap kali mengunjungi tempat ini, ya ada semacam perasaan yang istilahnya mengingat kembali bagaimana kekejaman di masa lalu ratusan tahun silam. Karena bagaimana mereka memaksa orang-orang kita untuk bekerja membangun benteng ini di bawah tedongan senjata.
The outer ring consists of a low wall designed with 5 bastions to cover all angles. The inner ring was built much higher with 5 circular towers that offered panoramic views.
Adalah menara pengawas, yang mana fungsi dari menara pengawas ini adalah mengawasi kapal-kapal yang masuk dari arah barat dan arah timur, mengawasi perkebunan-perkebunan pala yang dibangun Belanda di Kepulauan Banda Besar.
From here, it was easy to spot anyone trying to smuggle spices illegally. Those whom they caught, they threw into these cramped prison cells. They were built for political prisoners, but also for any of the locals who dared to sell nutmeg to anyone but the Dutch.
Capture didn't just mean imprisonment. It often meant a death sentence.
Di tempat ini dulunya punya tiang yang tinggi, cukup tinggi. Jadi orang-orang itu biasanya diikat. Kemudian mereka disiksa, dicambuk, kadang-kadang terus diinterogasi. Kenapa harus terlibat perang melawan VOC Belanda, apa alasannya. Ada beberapa orang yang memang benar-benar dinyatakan bersalah, kemudian mereka dibunuh di tempat ini. Darah-darah mereka itu kemudian akan mengalir melewati saluran air ini. Jadi, sementara ketika eksekusi berlangsung, orang-orang Belanda itu akan menonton dari bangku-bangku yang mereka...
But Dutch domination of the island's people and the money-spinning trade in nutmeg and mace was nearing its end. The British were coming.
The British had never relinquished their desire to get their hands on the spice trade.
And when the Netherlands fell to France in the Napoleonic Wars, the British sensed an opportunity and invaded the islands.
In August 1810, a naval squadron commanded by Captain Cole arrived in the waters of the Banda Sea.
Pasukan Inggris datang dari Selat Lontor di arah barat Kepulauan Banda. Masuk, kemudian berlabuh di depan Nassau dan akhirnya naik ke Banda Belgica dan melakukan penyerangan.
From the towers of this bastion, it seems impossible the British could have avoided detection. The guards in their sentry boxes would have sighted them as soon as they came over the horizon.
But Captain Cole was clever. He arrived at night under the cover of darkness.
At sunrise, Cole and his men launched their surprise attack and stormed Fort Belgica. They threw ladders against the side of the ramparts and climbed up under heavy musket fire.
Rather than stand and fight, the Dutch soldiers fled for their lives.
Within hours, the battle was over, and the British claimed control over the rest of the island.
But the Dutch were in no mood to give up their prized assets so easily. They rallied their troops and hit back.
It wouldn't be long before the Dutch reclaimed their stake. But Cole and his men uprooted hundreds of nutmeg seedlings to replant in other colonies.
With that, the Dutch stranglehold on the spice trade was fatally weakened. And as the colonial era faded into history, so too did the fort's significance. By the mid-1900s, it was completely abandoned. In 1991, Fort Belgica was restored and now serves as a tourist destination. Today, it's a powerful reminder of a brutal era when savagery and greed ruled supreme.
Di banyak tempat, bangunan-bangunan yang memiliki sejarah kelam itu perlu dipertahankan agar kita belajar bagaimana bangsa kita kemudian ditindas.
The ruins at Fort Nassau and Belgica stand as a sign of the violence and destruction wrought on this region by the colonizers. The Bandera really suffered under European colonialism.
These were state-funded trading organizations with the aim of increasing influence on the world stage. But in essence, they were just pirates.
And we can still see this dynamic playing out in the modern world today. We can still see war being fought as a business. We can still see economic interest driving conflicts of various sorts. And you still see corporations backed by governments trying to seize control of resources, seize control of certain regions for their resources.
In the former Soviet Republic of Belarus, near the Russian border, is a disturbing reminder of more troubled times.
It's actually very hard to make sense of this complex when you first see it, and that's kind of the point.
Crumbling interiors reveal a construction designed to command and conquer.
There are bunker-like structures built with thick, reinforced concrete, meant for keeping whoever was on the inside safe from something. And yet they afford a very good view of the surrounding landscape. That was no accident.
This complex was built way out in the middle of nowhere, and that's crucial. Given what they were doing here, they could not be near any large residential areas.
This was a theater of power, and the drama that played out here was intended to strike fear into the hearts of enemies, near and far.
In some ways, what happened here draws parallels with modern-day Russia.
An event of this size looked like it could only mean one thing: a full-scale invasion.
How important was this structure to an event that caused the Cold War to turn red hot? Yuri Shapovalov was an officer in the Soviet Army. He first came to this location in 1981.
Очень приятно находиться здесь спустя 40 лет, когда все изменилось, вырастали вековые деревья, окопы, те, которые мы копали 40 лет назад, все изменилось.
At the time of Yuri's visit, the world was a very different place.
Рассматривался, что противник западных на нас наступал. Точно я уже, скажем так, вот, и сказать не могу, потому что я уже и не помню. Это прошло 40 лет. Сколько этих водных было, сколько учений.
You would have had men in uniform swarming all over this place. Whistles, shouts, crashes booming all around. It would have felt like utter chaos. But this was organized chaos.
Whoever was in charge here needed to build something that was almost a fully functioning city, and they had to do it in record time.
And the superpower behind it had all the motivation it needed to achieve the staggering feat.
Up until 1980, when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, there had been a decade of détente, of increasing normalization of relations between the West and the East.
But by 1981, that was done with, and the Cold War was heating up all over again.
To make matters worse, communist rulers in Moscow were also facing growing unrest within their own borders.
In the late 1970s and early 1980s, there's a wave of anti-Soviet sentiment in Poland, and this is not good news for the Soviet Union.
The election of a Polish pope only served to add fuel to fire.
When Pope John Paul II is elected, he is the senior holy man in a technically atheist country. And that was a poke in the eye to officially atheist communism.
Even under communist rule, Poland had remained one of the most Catholic countries in Europe. So to now have a Catholic Polish Pope calling so visibly for resistance was a real threat to communist rule in the region. So they need to take care of things very quickly.
Moscow goes to the Polish defense minister and says, "You will crack down or we will invade."
Soon, troops began to amass in the Soviet-controlled state of Belarus, which shares a border with Poland.
Разместили лагерь в лесу, разместили палатки, разместили пункты хозяйственного довольствия, комнаты бытовые, ленинские, умывальники, линия умывальников, линия туалетов. Вот. А дальше приступили к оборудованию огневых позиций, которые предусматривали выполнение боевых задач.
So Western analysts see the Soviet army massing in Eastern Europe, and they have got to take seriously the idea that this is a Soviet land attack against NATO.
Something of this scale definitely looked like the precursor to an invasion.
But not all was as it seemed. These are the Dretton training grounds, the site of one of the largest military drills ever performed.
It was called West 81 or Zapad 81, Zapad being the Russian word for west. And on the surface, it was just a massive military exercise, but it was something more than that.
The Zapad exercise program is a proof of concept. And the concept they're proving is that the Soviet army can survive an American nuclear attack and then command and coordinate a response.
Мы находимся на командном пункте маневра. В 1981 году он выглядел совершенно по-другому. Здесь все было чисто, аккуратно, безопасно. И командный пункт был подготовлен для работы и генералов, и маршалов, и обыкновенных офицеров. Это наблюдательные щели, которые позволяли наблюдать за полем сражения в период проведения маневров.
Zapad 81 may have been presented as a carefully orchestrated training exercise, but the West continued to observe with deep suspicion. This was an era when one false move could have unleashed nuclear Armageddon.
There was great uncertainty about what was going to happen next. Everyone in the West is acutely aware that this could be cover for World War III.
Вот. Дело в том, что мы НАТО как таковое и все остальные даже в расчет не брали, потому что подготовка войск была настолько мощная, что НАТО не надо было вмешиваться, потому что ее просто расколотили и разнесли. Вот такое было, скажем, чувство. Мы об этом даже не разговаривали, потому что НАТО там мощнейшая группировка. Вы даже представить себе за 2 часа задачи, которые стояли перед нами.
All the West could do was watch and wait as the drama unfolded. The Soviets filmed the entire production, running it like the set of a Hollywood movie. Only here, the missiles were all real.
Ой, 2С3, извиняюсь, 2С3. Это акация, самоходная установка, которая стреляет, дальность более 17 километров. Это страшное оружие, которое может развалить окоп противника. Оно может убить осколками на расстоянии порядка 200 метров.
News of the exercises quickly spread around the world.
Понятие советской армии считалось, что она сильнее всех. И кого-то напугать мы просто такой задачи не ставили. Мы просто знали, что мы выполним любую задачу. Вот. Но это действительно так, потому что...
It was theater. It was national security theater. The Soviet army had a lot of amphibious armored vehicles. And the problem is that the armored vehicles could not cross rivers very well. So what they did was they built concrete lanes across the bottoms of the rivers just for this exercise.
It was a demonstration to the rest of the world that the Soviets had the numbers and the will to overrun Europe if they so wished.
But Western leaders were not the only ones spooked by this massive display of Soviet strength. The intimidation tactics were also intended to send a very powerful message to Poland's dissenting population.
One of the reasons this to look really good is that this is meant to make clear to the Polish government that the Soviet army is ready to invade Poland, and there will be nothing that the Polish government can do about it. That is very clearly intended here.
The exercises at Dretton played out for 8 consecutive days and are said to have involved up to 150,000 troops.
In Poland, the Soviets didn't have to mount a military incursion to put down anti-Soviet demonstrations in the way they had done in Czechoslovakia in '68. So you could say that the show of force was a big success from the Soviet perspective.
And much to the relief of nervous NATO forces, on the 12th of September 1981, the Soviet military simply packed up and headed home. The Dretton training fields would never again host military maneuvers of such magnitude.
Все оставили как есть. Для других ничего. Но, к сожалению, Советский Союз распался. Вот, все это так осталось.
There have been many exercises in the following decades, but none that could quite match this one in terms of the scale and global attention.
Today, the war games at Dretton are over, but danger still remains.
Потому что есть случаи, где дети, да и взрослые, находя боеприпасы, начинают, участвовать в их разборке, в результате взрыв, то руки нет, то глаза, то еще что-то.
For soldiers like Yuri, the Cold War cast a long shadow. And although full-scale war never erupted, the events of West 81 had a lasting impact.
Маленький это не Советский Союз. Этого всего не надо уже. Наверное, надо заниматься мирной жизнью больше уделять внимание мирной жизни.